So now we are going to expand this particular conversation, and this is really the guts of why we're all here. We're going to be looking at broadening the tax base. What did I say it was? What's possible, sustainable and fair? And so I'd like to welcome to the stage Peter Davidson from ACOSS, Professor Helen Hodgson from the Curtin University and the National Foundation for Australian Women, and Thomas Walker, who's here to represent the future with Think Forward, which is Tom's think tank that looks at the future generations. And I'm going to join them too. All right. So Miranda's given us quite an overview there of some options we could consider, and of course we got some very bold prescriptions from Ken this morning too. So I'm going to ask each of you, as we've arranged, to talk a little bit about your thoughts on this topic. And Peter, I'll start with you today. You obviously, for many years, have led the very important tax work at ACOSS, and we're very grateful for the work you've done over many years. What do you think is possible, sustainable and fair?
Thanks, Emma. Can you all hear me? I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands we meet, and thanks to Annette for that warm welcome to country this morning. I'm going to talk mostly about personal income tax. Miranda's given a great overview, and tomorrow we'll be discussing business and environmental taxes in more depth. Income tax has had a bad rap because it's visible, it's in everyone's payslip, and we believe it only falls on workers, and increasingly, as Ken pointed out, younger workers. But it's also our main progressive tax base that's funded most of the growth in essential services and supports and government expenditures since the end of World War II. And it's based on capacity to pay, in theory. And the distinguishing feature of income taxes, unlike taxes on consumption, is that they capture investment income. And that, by definition, is the difference between a tax on income and a tax on consumption. You're taxing investment returns. A tax on consumption is essentially a tax on wages and income support. And so if you shifted from taxing income to taxing consumption, you can pretty quickly figure out who would benefit the most and who would benefit the least. So that's in theory. Income tax taxes investment income. As Miranda's graph shows, it's a small sliver of the total revenue from income tax. But that does make it a powerful tool for redistribution from those with the most, and makes it unpopular with people who are wealthy and rent-seeking businesses and companies. And they are in there lobbying in every parliamentary session to preserve the loopholes and shelters in the system that particularly benefit certain interests, the ones we've been talking about, right? For example, the government had a bill before the Senate to lift the tax on superannuation fund income for large accounts over $3 million by 15%. Now, you'd think that wouldn't be a hard thing to get up. Affected a small number of people. It was a modest reform of superannuation. It was scheduled for debate in the Senate last week. It was pulled because the government didn't have the numbers. Why? Because the self-managed super fund lobby, the farmers lobby, the venture capital lobby, and various representatives of various legal and accounting representatives and advisors of wealthy people, essentially, ganged up against it and lobbied the crossbench fiercely over a period of 1.5 years. Now, I was at a meeting where all of these folk were represented, called by one of the crossbenchers, this was last year, at which all of them put their hands on their heart and said, oh, we know the system's unfair. Wealthy people should be paying more tax on their superannuation. But there's this unintended consequence What about farmers who've got their $3 million farms in Tasmania in their self-managed super fund? Won't they be disadvantaged? Venture capitalists, they'll be disadvantaged. Unintended consequences. And this is a case study in how tax reform works or doesn't work in Australia. It helps explain why it's hard to achieve. Those who benefit from tax shelters know them really well and lobby hard to keep them. Most people don't know. Who understands superannuation? Who understands how superannuation is taxed? How many people know that when your super fund starts paying you a pension after you retire, all of its investment income, dividends, capital gains, interest, is tax-free? It's extraordinarily generous and explains, to a large degree, why the system is intergenerationally fair, as Ken was pointing out earlier. Another hole in the income tax base is the 50% capital gains tax discount, which we've talked about a little. And to illustrate how it works, let's assume, for instance, that ACOSS is paying me $200,000 a year, and I've just made $50,000 profit on some shares I've sold. I can dream, okay? I will only pay tax on half that $50,000, so that capital gain is income, but instead of being taxed at 47% on that income, as I am on my wage, in effect I'm taxed at 23.5%. Now let's assume, for example, that Helen is a full-time wage earner on an average full-time wage around $80,000. She's paying tax at 32 cents in the dollar on her next dollar of income. So Helen pays 32 cents, I pay 23.5%. Helen's on 80,000, I'm on 250,000. This brings to mind the famous statement by Warren Buffett about how his secretary faced a higher tax rate than he did, and that was true. Warren was paying 37 cents in the dollar and his secretary 17 cents in the dollar. He also said, "We were told a rising tide would lift all boats, but the rising tide has lifted all yachts." Now, I could go on. There are many ways in which wealthy and well-advised people can avoid contributing, can avoid paying income tax. They can shelter their income in trust and private companies, for example. And we'll hear tomorrow about international companies that shift profits into tax havens, and wealthy individuals do that as well. So if we care about funding for essential services and safety nets and doing it equitably, then we need to strengthen the income tax, not reduce it. We need to move beyond the perennial debate over tax rates and thresholds. It's important, but that's not tax reform. And focus more about what experts call base broadening. That is, taxing different forms of income more consistently. And here's the thing, if we did that, it would improve efficiency as much as it would improve equity. So if you think about it, if we tax different investments more consistently, then tax is less of a factor. There'd be more productive investment, less speculation in assets due to that 50% capital gains tax discount, for example. This has real-world consequences, as we heard in the housing session. If we taxed profits from the sale of rental housing properly and didn't allow negative gearing, then home prices would probably be low, because those tax breaks are encouraging speculation in assets. And consistent taxation of investment income was a foundation of the Henry Report. Even if we didn't care about equity, there are good reasons to close off unproductive shelters and loopholes. Now, of course, there are many other things we need to discuss, including properly taxing land, mining and other economic rents, and the role of tax policy in climate change. Governments won't talk about these things before an election, but we can here. And I'd just like to congratulate Emma per Capita and all of the partners involved in organising this gig for daring to talk about that thing that cannot be discussed before an election, namely tax reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Helen, to you, not just a tax expert, but here with National Foundation for Australian Women, so able to put a very strong gender lens over this conversation for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would also like to acknowledge that we're talking today on Wurundjeri land, but I would also like to highlight a comment that Miranda made in her session, that what we're talking about today affects Indigenous people from around the whole country. And whatever comes out of this meeting, I think that we need to consider that as a part of our overall outcomes. Now, my area of research, as Emma has just said, two areas really, superannuation and gender, and the two overlap a lot. I'm going to start by saying that the one piece of paper I brought with me to the conference in case I needed to refer to any data was the tax expenditures and impact statement. And I understand some of the team that prepared that are in the room today, and I would like to say that if you want to know anything about where the tax expenditures are, that is the go-to document. There are, out of the 6 top expenditures that are listed, 5 relate to wealth, 2 superannuation, 3 capital gains. The 6th is the other thing that we have talked about already today, deductions on rental properties. Now, I think that says an awful lot about some of the imbalances in our system. So the wealthy, and if you look at the tables and the charts that are in the TEIS, if you have a look at those, you will see that it is primarily people in the top 2 quartiles, two quintiles, I should say, and primarily men that benefit from these tax expenditures. The data is there, it shows you. What it doesn't show you, in this report, you have to go elsewhere, is that because superannuants don't lodge tax returns, the data on what happens with the wealthy people once they fall out of the tax system isn't really reflected in the tax expenditure statement. So I'd just like to make a couple of comments about the super system. The first one is that we should all be aware of the premise that the Australian retirement income system is based on 3 main pillars: pension, other investments, superannuation, and the 4th pillar that most commentators add now is housing, and whether you own your housing or not. So let's have a look at the way the tax system impacts on those people. First of all, if you're a pensioner, a full pensioner receives $29,744. It does phase out as you go up, but you're entitled to what they call the SAPTO, the Seniors and Pensioners Tax Offset, which effectively means you pay no tax until you reach $32,719. To 79, I should say. Now let's compare that to a wage earner, or compare that to a person who's on job seeker, who is receiving less to start with. Now, if you are a superannuant, you pay no tax, not only no tax personally, and this is the damage that Howard did to our system in 2007. Prior to that, we had a fairly unusual international system where tax was paid partly when the money went into your fund, partly by the fund, and partly when it came out of the fund. Howard abolished that 3rd leg. So that means that superannuants who are drawing down on their income, even though they have paid some tax along the way, it is nothing like the marginal tax rate. So theirs is tax-free, no matter what. If you're receiving other income, then that all depends on how you've been able to structure it. Are you drawing on capital gains, as Peter pointed out with his example? Are you drawing on dividends, where you get the dividend offset? It's really hard. Those are the 3 categories, but you can see that of the 3, the full pensioner is the person who has the least advantage, and even that is better than a person on job seeker. So there's a lot of vertical inequity in there. That's leaving aside the issue of home ownership. If, as most baby boomers have, and you saw the charts earlier, if you're fortunate enough to own your home, then that is secure. If you're paying rent, then the amount you get on Commonwealth Rent Assistance is completely inadequate, and the work that Anglicare does in its annual report on rental affordability is a really good resource to unpick what people are being charged for rents. So there's a lot of inequities, a lot of vertical inequity there. Now, the other issue, we've heard about capital gains, but there are a number of ways that people can structure their income if it's not from wages. And I'm not going to say that these are all bad. For example, we hear a lot of negativity around trusts, and there's good reason for that. But before we say abolish trusts, how many of you work for a charity? How many of those charities are funded by trusts? How many of you have set up wills where there is some money to be managed? That's all done through trusts. So there is a good legal and historic background for trusts. It's just the way we use them in Australia is completely different to how they're used in the rest of the world. We use them as a wealth sharing vehicle. And the real challenge around wealth is that it's around the timing issues. So if you can park your money in a company or park your money in a trust until you reach a point when you're drawing on superannuation, so you've got no taxable income anymore and you can take all your wealth out. Or you can pass it on to your children because we don't have an inheritance tax. So it's about the timing issues, that is an area of significant concern. And for those real tax nerds in the room, I've read today that the tax office has just lost another significant case about taking money from the trust out via a company, the Bendel case on appeal. We've lost that one's been lost by the tax office. So it's there, and this is the problem. We take structures that are perfectly good legal structures in place for many years for very good reasons, and we abuse them. The tax system has allowed these structures to become abused. And probably the biggest indictment is that back at the end of Rudd going into the Abbott government, there was a huge discussion going around about how to reform the taxation trusts, just rewriting the rules that are completely illogical for most people. And that got shredded, never to be seen again. And so we are working with laws that are completely outdated and not fit for purpose. And I think that is a significant issue that needs to be dealt with. So I will leave it at there, and we can deal with questions later.
Thank you, Helen. We can indeed deal with questions later. Just a reminder to put your questions in through the Civility app so that I can read them out to the panel shortly. But before we get to questions, we're going to hear from Thomas Walker. We'll have a lot to say that will echo, I'm sure, what Ken said this morning. Think Forward has a current campaign called Tax Wealth Not Work, and Tom's interest is all about the security of future generations. Over to you.
Thanks, Emma. Is it working? Very good. Hi, everyone. So good news, because Ken did all the heavy lifting for me this morning, I got to throw out a whole page worth of notes, which means I get to focus on what we do at Think Forward and what we want to see reformed in our tax system, which is much more interesting than getting into intergenerational equity over the next 50 years in our tax system. But we started Think Forward quite a few years ago now, 2018, 2019, which we call the smashed avocado years, because this is when we were being told that if we just worked harder, bought less breakfasts, we'd be able to buy that house, which annoyed us greatly. And so we wanted to start a little organisation which would talk about the intergenerational inequities in our economic and tax systems, and how the issues were structural, not solved by working harder. And so we predominantly work with younger generations, so education, doing surveys, and we argue that our futures are being denied. And so we notice that in our daily lives, right? Like there's student loan debt, the housing crisis, growing tax collections, growing intergenerational wealth inequality. One day you might have your best mate can suddenly afford to buy a home because they've got a gift from their mum and dad. These kind of issues are then also compounded by climate change, obviously, and the hole that's going to blow in the budget. And we think it's also related to the mental health crisis we're having in younger people who feel like they can't get ahead economically, declining or low rates of entrepreneurship, and our declining birth rate. And so we argue that the tax system plays an often hidden role in all of this. Probably not hidden to this room, but to our younger audience, definitely hidden. So we say that it's natural that older Australians naturally control much of our wealth. They're the shareholders, they own property, they run our companies, they dominate politics. That's all completely normal. But as custodians, we argue that they have a responsibility to share capital and opportunity with younger generations. It's vital that younger generations can get on the bottom of the economic security ladder, this idea of the social compact, that hard work and effort results in a level of economic security. But today, our tax system doesn't support this. It rewards wealth accumulation and speculation over the hard work and effort of younger Australians. So we have a situation where younger Australians, as already pointed out on this panel, that they're often paying higher tax rates than millionaires, property investors, wealthy retirees, even entire corporations. And we also have a situation where a younger person wants to get an education or provide shelter for the family, and we load them up with records amount of debt, which they then spend their entire working life trying to get out from underneath. And I guess the old capitalist proverb that you need money to make money has never been more true. Like, if you've got $500,000, you dump it into super, you dump it into housing, you're rewarded with tax breaks. If you earn an average wage, you've got no chance, basically. So a lot of people say to us in our surveys that, like at school, they were told that if you work hard, go to uni, do everything right, you'll be rewarded. And increasingly, that doesn't feel true to a lot of people. And that's really concerning. Just particularly with these sort of rise in like far-right narratives about slashing public services and slashing tax. Like, if people are getting frustrated and disengaging, like, that's very fertile ground for that kind of language. So in terms of the topic, broadening the base, we have this new campaign called Tax Wealth, Not Work, which the first step is actually not so much broadening the base, but it's about fixing our existing base and plugging all the holes and stopping it eroding. As there's been lots of examples today, we give more money to property investors and through capital gains tax discounts than what we spend on education and including universities. And then throw in all the other subsidies, and you can see how our tax system is more like a sieve than a bucket that collects money fairly. If we did this, it would also mean that our tax system tilts back towards supporting work, effort, entrepreneurship, rather than wealth accumulation and rent seeking. Once we've done that, then I guess the second step we would like to see taken is think about how we tax wealth better. We're not even proposing like a new wealth tax. We actually think there's a lot of ways we can do it better with our existing settings. So whether that's taxing inheritance and gifts, large super balances, trusts, lands, resources, carbon consumption, that would all significantly contribute to raising more revenue, which then we can spend on three things, which we think are important. Preventing the share of tax collected from younger generations from growing unfairly, as projected by the Intergenerational Report. We've had the idea of indexing the tax brackets, like hens, and we think that would be an interesting place to start exploring. We want to better support people trying to set up their lives, which includes students, like making university affordable, student support payments, new parents, carers, but also the under and unemployed who just want that opportunity to have a go, and also repair government budgets so we can invest in the things that matter to all of us, and also make sure we're leaving some economic or fiscal firepower for future generations to deal with climate change, because at the moment all those costs are being left to younger generations and future generations. In closing, I just say that our tax system is denying us a future of shared prosperity on a healthy planet. And I think it's also denying us this Australian myth of a fair go, and without putting wealth and how it's taxed on the table, I think that idea of a fair go will continue to be denied.
Well said, Tom. You can see why Tom was one of the first people I asked to participate in this event. And what you do at Think Forward is really important. And I know for many years it was all done under volunteer steam. So thank you for your contribution. I'm going to kick us off with some questions that are starting to come in. And I'm going to open with the one that's got quite a few variations thereof, which is, let's talk about the GST. Miranda, both you and Ken support broadening the base of the GST, and you suggest lifting the rate slightly. It is a low rate consumption tax by international standards, but as the questioner here says, it is a flat tax that affects people who are socially, economically disadvantaged and raises the cost of living. If we were to broaden the base of the GST to things like private education, for example, and to raise it to 12%, what would the compensatory mechanisms need to be for those at the lowest end of the income distribution? I'll start up by posing that to you, Miranda.
So it is a distraction. So before I deal with that question, I do want to say I agree with Peter, right, that actually that income tax, which I hope I showed is really our most important tax, you could think of it itself as a public good. We have to repair the base of that tax. There is more revenue there, but also we may want to make sure that workers and young workers are not paying too much income tax. So we do need to think of the whole base. So that brings me to the GST and the excises. Look, there are some things that they do have equity implications. There's no doubt about that. If we increase the rate a bit on the current base of the GST, we would already have the exemption of food, housing, education. We don't tax water, for example, water supply. In a world where, I know it rains a bit in Melbourne at the moment, but in a world where actually water is a scarce resource, there's actually an argument for us to more appropriately price and tax water to achieve other goals. How would we compensate if we were to increase that rate or broaden that base, for example, to private education? At the bottom, well, we already know we need to increase income support in a sustained and permanent way, and one could then use that to compensate further for any consumption tax increase. So you can use that transfer system. For the middle, don't forget, you've got to bring the middle with you in tax reform. For the big middle, the mass of workers, you do need to think about the tax rates on labour income, right? That's the trade-off. The advantage of a consumption tax, it doesn't tax the return to capital. Peter's exactly right. But it does tax consumption of those who are not earning labour income that's taxable. And so to the extent that that consumption is taking place in Australia. So it's a smaller piece of the puzzle, but I think you can compensate appropriately also doing the income tax reform.
I'd just like to comment as well on this one, because the data show that if you were to look at some specific areas like health and education, they're areas where the tax exemptions actually have a regressive impact, because they're primarily used by people with the salary income, the income from other sources, to access those private services. So to me, what would be needed there as well would be to look at the funding that goes into the public system. It's horrifying when you read the reports that came out this week about the increased enrolments in private education because people don't think kids are getting access to a good education through the public system. If you were going to say we're going to now put a GST on private schooling and private health, but in exchange for that, we're going to reduce the gap payments and we're going to increase the quality and the expenditure on public schools, then I think that would go a long way to dealing with the compensation that's needed.
Just another example of why we shouldn't do these things piecemeal and need to take a holistic approach. Peter, did you want to jump in onto the GST? I suspect you might.
I'd love to jump in on the GST. Well, firstly, some factual issues, and then secondly, going to the political economy of tax reform. Factual issues, compared with other OECD countries, we're a low taxing nation. That's established and agreed. A lot of people who advocate higher GST or more reliance on it say, but we rely much more on income tax than most other countries. But if you take account of the social insurance taxes in countries that have those systems, most of Europe, for example, the balance, and the US, the balance between taxing income and consumption isn't that much different in Australia. And actually, the average Australian worker pays about the same overall average, not marginal, rate of tax as their counterpart in the US. So we're not a high income taxing country. And as I mentioned, a tax on consumption is essentially a tax on labour income and income support, only you pay it when you're consuming. And I don't think workers who get wage increases will entirely ignore the fact that the cost of what they buy with those wages has risen. On the political economy, and this is where it gets really difficult, if you look at the distributional impact of a shift from taxing income to consumption, just lower all of the rates of income tax and lift the GST to raise the same revenue, top 20% gains substantially, they're the investors, and it's the lowest 40%, particularly those on income support, who gain the least. And it's true that many people who are retired and relatively wealthy are at least being taxed on their consumption. But it's a very blunt instrument because it's equally affecting the maximum rate pensioner. If you wanted to tax wealth more effectively, you wouldn't do it in that way. But the kicker for us is that because of that distributional impact, particularly on people on the lowest incomes, the people on the lowest incomes are reliant on so-called compensation to maintain their living standards in the event of the reform. How does that compensation happen? Well, it can only happen for many people through the social security system. Can the government that undertakes that reform guarantee that the next government won't cut income support? And so it leaves people in a more vulnerable position, and that's always been the kicker for us. Having said that, we do rely on it less, on consumption taxes less than most other countries, but largely because we don't tax as much as most of them overall.
And again, we can't do these things in isolation. We have to look at it holistically. A question here I'm going to, and this has come from either the floor or the room, or the live stream, it's all equal here. I'm going to put this to Helen and then Tom. Someone saying, I paid tax my whole working life. I've paid enough tax to be supported in retirement. Why should tax on superannuation be equivalent to taxes on people who have not yet paid their dues?
Very simple, because the amount of tax that you have paid on your superannuation is not as much as people pay on their labour. The fact is that you put it aside during your working life and it's taxed concessionally at that point. So yes, you have paid tax. You've paid tax on your wages. You've paid half the rate of tax on the super that you've put aside. And then the fund only pays tax, there's the tax on what you put in. The tax pays on its investment that it earns for you at half the rate that most people pay tax. So overall, the fact that you have paid taxes, you've put your super away, the fact that you that has been taxed at a lower rate in itself means that you're paying less tax overall. Now, let me put it to you this way. Look at the data on who uses the health system. Once you're once you're not paying tax, you're not paying Medicare levy anymore. Who is it that is most using the health services through the Medicare system? Look at the aged care reforms. Now, I have had a look at the new costing structure, but even those are very heavily subsidised. Who's that going to be helping? That's going to be helping retirees who are not paying the normal rate of tax. And let me tell you, a domestic issue that I have with my partner all the time is the use of this term self-funded retiree. Excuse me, but during your working life, it was funded by government concessions, and now that you're taking it out, it is still funded by government concessions. So I'm sorry, but I do think that we have to rethink the fact that all income coming out of superannuation tax-free. I'm not saying it should be at the standard marginal rate. There has to be some adjustment made for the fact that tax was paid on the way through, but we can't sustain the way it is now.
Pretty unequivocal. Thanks, Helen. Tom?
Yeah, that's great. Perfect. This came up a lot when I was working on the government's aged care task force, like this kind of idea that I've worked hard my entire life, I've built up this nest egg, I might live on the income off that, but I'm not going to touch the base of it. And just completely ignoring the influence society, tax concessions have had on that wealth growing over their working life. And there's just that real inability to see that, and that just because you're older and wealthier doesn't mean you haven't had a great big hand up from society and you shouldn't still keep contributing to our public purse.
Can I jump in? So I just want to add to this something that people tend to forget because we're talking about older and younger, for example, is that even among the older people, even among superannuation owners, we're talking about the top 10% or the top 5% or 1% in terms of taxing more highly that concessionally taxed return and stock of wealth over time. The number of people who have a $3 million balance in their superannuation, this is a tiny fraction of Australian workers, people who have worked hard through their lives and accumulate. It's also way more than you need for a dignified and comfortable retirement, which is the purpose of superannuation, now finally legislated. And just to link it to Tom's other work, people often talk, for example, about access to home ownership and the bank of mum and dad. And that, this is sort of somehow becoming increasingly important, and this is how young people are going to have to... The number of young people who have a bank of mum and dad is the top 10% of families with young people. The other 90% do not have the bank of mum and dad. So although we're talking about intergenerational equity, it's actually intragenerational inequity that is actually real and current. It's not in the future.
Hear,
I
hear.
think this is some of what Tom is talking about.
Yeah, I just want to dwell on this point for a moment, because while I think Tom's work is really important for all the reasons Ken said today, the tax system shouldn't discourage people. It should support people to get ahead. It should give them opportunity, and it's no longer doing that for too many young people. But what we're really, it suits, I think, a lot of the commentary class and the media to talk about generational warfare because they don't want to talk about class. And effectively, what we are talking about is class. And the more that this generational divide persists, when the top 10% do inherit a lot of money and the rest of us don't, then that just becomes a good old-fashioned class divide. And if we want to maintain the Australia that most of us hold that myth in our head that we're the land of the fair go, the working man's paradise, then we have to be willing to say we have a growing class divide in this country. That's what we hear about today.
We're actually facing the biggest transfer of wealth as baby boomers, the oldest baby boomers, start to pass away. Now, these are the baby boomers who didn't have 9 and 12%, who only had 3, 4, 5% when they were working, and it's already showing up in the data. Now, the situation is, ignore the $3 million cap on the legislation that didn't pass. The cap now for a transfer balance that you can put into your retirement fund is going up, I think, to 2 million this year. 2 million times 2 if you're part of a married couple. That means that you will not use that during your lifetime, even if you did 3 world cruises on the Queen Elizabeth. So that is going to be passed on to your children. And a big part of superannuation advising now is finding ways in which you can get it passed on to your children free of tax. So that's the big issue there. It's what's going to happen with the transfer of wealth over the next 15 years.
Tom?
I don't. So I wasn't meant to be up here from a lived experience perspective, but I think this question of inheritance and gifts is really critical as we've sort of outlined the scale of it growing. And I don't think it is actually the top 10% of families. I lost my mum to cancer 2 years ago, so she was 58, and I got a quarter of her superannuation balance, and she'd worked really hard her entire life and didn't get to spend any of it. And that quarter of that super balance was about equal to a 20% house deposit. And being able to not have to save up for a house deposit and struggle for the next 10 years and put money aside and do a job I didn't really like that much, it was so freeing economically. Like, I could do a job I loved, I could provide a house for me and my wife, and we're about to have our baby, and just having that economic security issues taken away is so powerful. And the fact that only some people get that, and the rest of the younger people have to slave away for 10, 15 years saving up a house deposit is deeply unfair.
So that brings me to this question, and Miranda was the first person brave enough to use the phrase inheritance tax today. And this is a very good question. Given the cultural normalisation of the removal of inheritance tax, i.e. nobody wants to talk about bringing it back, how would it ever be feasible to reintroduce one? Are there backdoors into taxing wealth that would be more politically palatable?
I don't think I should. I'm sure the others have views. One we've heard already from Helen is appropriately taxing superannuation as a kind of substantial financial bucket of wealth. Another is appropriately taxing land and capturing that land value either through the land banking. I do agree with a lot of what was said on that land panel there from Prosper Australia as well, or ongoing land tax. The challenge with land tax on, for example, the primary residence is, of course, that people don't always have cash flow, or they worry about cash flow, or they have mortgages and they worry about servicing them. So one possibility is to kind of build up that obligation over time and have that on the transfer of the property or something recognised in order to access that stock of wealth before death. Inheritance taxes are complex, but one can have a pretty high threshold, and that was the great shame of 1981, why we didn't just raise the threshold, which was definitely too low. The UK has a 40% inheritance tax over a threshold. Unfortunately, what they do, which we might have to do, is they exempt farming property. So you can imagine what that has done. All these rich people in the UK are now farmers.
And they all marched on Parliament recently, apparently, too.
That's right. So there are these challenges, but I think it operates as a backstop to that income tax.
Okay. I'm going to give one more question. It's come from David Morowitz, who funds our annual tax survey and has for 15 years. I've said that before, but thank you again. David asks, any views on the Greens' proposal for a wealth tax on billionaires with safeguards to stop those who send their wealth offshore from evading it, as outlined in the proposal? I'm going to throw that to Miranda first. Sorry. How do we tax billionaires? As far as I can tell, they become billionaires by not paying tax.
Well, so Australian billionaires, of course, don't hold their assets directly. I mean, they hold them in companies, right? They hold equity, shareholder equity. Gina has shareholder equity, very, very substantial shareholder equity. So really what you're talking about is rather similar to what has been talked about in the US. That is essentially a tax on accrued shareholder value.
Yep.
There might be some other sources of wealth. That's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about taxing billionaires. So it's possible to do that. The probable or likely behavioural response to that is to sell down a bit of your equity. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? You wouldn't get much revenue, but you sell down a bit of the equity and maybe monopolies become slightly less substantial over time. I actually think it is actually perfectly feasible. The big challenge is political.
But as you note, the behavioural change would result in probably less revenue than the headline expectation would be.
I think you have to assume that there will be not only substantial planning responses, if there were, but that there will be market response and behavioural response. And so in a sense, the revenue impact is unpredictable. I think the other thing to remember is that much as we might like to tax billionaires more, I said this, if you taxed the billionaires around the world, you know, if you took all of their wealth, I know we're not proposing that, you could finance the government of New Zealand for 2 years.
Yeah.
So it was said earlier this morning, the scale of philanthropy or the scale of taxing wealth, so few people, is not enough to fund government, but it's still important from an equity perspective.
It's important, but it's not going to pay for all the things we want. Yeah. Helen?
I haven't seen the detail of the Greens proposal, but what I would say is that once you start talking about wealth at this scale, you have to have a look at the international links, the international shareholdings, the international connections. And I know that's one of the things that the BEPS base erosion profit shifting project is looking at. One of the pillars, I think, is looking at individuals. But I stay away from BEPS, so I'm going to suggest that this comes up tomorrow's session on international tax.
Very good. All right, well, that is sadly all we've got time for on this very important panel discussion, but lots of good ideas, and we'll be following up on all of them. Before I throw to Peter, who's got more homework for you, before we go to afternoon tea, please join me again to thank Miranda Stewart, Peter Davidson, Helen Hodgson and Tom Walker.
How are we all going? It's in the third quarter almost of day one. We're all ready for a coffee break, but we've got one more bit of work to do. I was just talking to Cass up the back, not while these people were talking, obviously, just about one of the challenges. There are so many ideas. How do we prioritise? Do we, as a theory of change, go for one thing or everything? One thing is a start of the conversation. Are there any of the ideas that came out of this session and earlier today that really rock your boat? So it's just interesting. So you, again, this is a prioritisation tool. So you just rank it down the line. Really interested to see what people come up with. So the options we've got: tax wealth, not work, which is Tom's campaign; inheritance tax; carbon tax, which Ken was talking about this morning; taxing economic rents, as we were talking about; broadening the GST tax base; or taxing business cash flow. So I know it'll take a couple of minutes for people to put it out, but we'd love the feedback because it helps inform the final paper out of this wonderful event.
It does.